Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed, and welcome to this fabulous venue. I'll just run through, if I could, the structure of the evening before we get going. And that is that Anne and I will chat for about an hour, and then you and she will chat for about half an hour. We'll see how the timings go. Yeah, we'll see how the timings go. I should say Anne is convinced that if she and I talk for an hour, there'll be people sloping out the back. So it's up to you to stay in your seats, please. I'm not going to do a long introduction of Anne Applebaum. You obviously know who she is, otherwise you wouldn't have come here tonight. The list of books is long. The list of awards is very long. We're here particularly to discuss her new book, Autocracies, Inc., which is sitting high up on bestseller lists. And I think it's fair to say, although we will be discussing it, it walks hand in hand with her previous book, Twilight of Democracy. It can get a bit gloomy at times in Applebaum land, but there is also lots of hope and lots of provocative thought as well. A quick point about questions at the end. A question has a rising intonation at the end. A statement does not. And we are looking for questions for Anne. And I will ask for clumps of questions when they come. There are also people watching at home or at their offices or anywhere. It might be online. Please put your questions in as well. I have a screen in front of me. I will try and take as many of them as I can. And the very last thing is, if you do see me at any point squinting horribly at my page, it's because I've annotated it with my terrible handwriting. It's not that I've got bored of anything that you or Anne is saying. I'm just trying to work out what my brilliant questions should be. Let us kick off now. As I say, we'll have a chat for about an hour, and then we will go into questions from the audience, both here and online. And finally, just to reiterate, Anne will be signing books at the end up here on the stage, so do stick around for that if you so desire. Let's start off, Anne, with the big picture of the book that you have written. You had a big idea behind the book. Explain it, if you would, to the audience.
So, first of all, thank you all so much for coming, for filling this amazing church. Makes me feel more important than I am, I think. The book describes a network. It's not an alliance. It's not an axis. It's a network of countries, of governments who work together for transactional reasons. It is not united by ideology. So it includes communist China, nationalist Russia, theocratic Iran, Bolivarian socialist Venezuela, North Korea, and a handful of other countries who don't share a common vision of the world, who don't believe they're building the same kind of society, but who do have a set of common interests. These are all countries that are autocracies. I use that word specifically precisely because they're all so different. They have different titles and different names, but these are all countries whose leaders feel they should be able to rule without checks and balances, without transparency, without the rule of law. They control all the levers of power in their societies, either as individuals or as political parties, or as, in a couple of cases, small groups of elites. And they object strongly to people who think they should be more closely examined, or they should be blocked. Towards that end, they push back against opposition inside their own countries, but increasingly they also push back against the language of democracy, the language of rights, and the language of transparency around the world. And so maybe I can sum it up by saying they don't necessarily have the same goal, but they have the same enemy. And the enemy is us, you, pretty much everybody in this room. People who live in the democratic world. I try not to use the word West in the book because I think it's broader than that, and also I would like to include the democratic oppositions in those countries. Anybody who speaks about rights, who speaks about transparency, who speaks about the rule of law, these are the people who they need to push back against, physically, militarily, but also ideologically and in other ways. And that's really the cause that knits them together.
Is it fair to say the difference between the autocrats that you're looking at now and the autocracies of the 20th century is that word network that you used earlier?
I think it's the word, I mean, obviously there have been autocratic alliances before. Yeah. I think it's a network of, as I said, ideologically dissimilar regimes, although there are a few other things they have that are different too. So mostly we're talking about very, very wealthy people. We're talking about billionaires. Mm-hmm. Previous generations of dictators didn't have billions in secret bank accounts and property all over the world, or not many of them did. Yeah. So they have a global reach and a set of global contacts. They also have an access to technology that is new. So they have both surveillance technology, obviously, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit more. Yeah. They have common methods of doing propaganda, of using the internet. They collaborate actually on their propaganda, sometimes just by imitation and sometimes deliberately. And so they have technological means of reaching people that I don't think prior generations did. So those things make them a little bit different.
And they, through their networks, reinforce each other in various different ways.
Yes, I mean, they're also interested in one another's fate. Yeah. In a very precise way. I mean, actually, I talk about this a little bit in the book, but one of the best examples, and it happens to be a current example, is Venezuela. Yeah. So Venezuela is a country that was the richest country in South America, is now the poorest, probably produces more refugees than Ukraine. It has all kinds of natural resources, oil and so on, but it has a government that is led by a group of people who would prefer to see their country join the category of failed states rather than to give up power. They probably should have fallen years ago. It's a very unpopular government. It's so unpopular that they're now, as I understand it, very nervous about the lower levels of the army, whether the army is loyal anymore. But nevertheless, it's remained in power, and one of the most important reasons it's remained in power is because the Venezuelan regime has had weapons from Russia, it has had investment from China, from Chinese companies into Venezuelan state companies and state-linked companies. It's had the secret police reinforcements from Cuba, and it's even had, and this is, I think, one of the most interesting relationships on the planet, it has a very close and intense relationship with Iran. And if you think about it, why should a left-wing populist government in Venezuela have a close relationship to a theocracy in Iran? They have nothing to do with one another historically, culturally, geographically, or any other way. But they do have a really important common interest, and that's evading sanctions. And they have helped one another evade sanctions. The Iranians have helped the Venezuelans with oil and gas technology. Venezuelans, in turn, we believe, have offered visas and other kinds of documents to Hezbollah activists so that they can travel in Europe. I mean, they've found a realm of common cause that turns out to be very important. And so as a group, you can say that Autocracy, Inc. has kept Venezuela going. It's probably kept Belarus going. I mean, you can point to it. I write in the book about Zimbabwe, but you could point to some other weaker autocracies who've been buoyed by this network.
You write in the book, nobody's democracy is safe. When you look around the world, do you see specific countries teetering? Or is that an argument more broadly that the idea of democracy is being eaten up from the bottom?
So I think it's important to understand that no democracy is ever safe. There's no such thing as a political system that's guaranteed to last forever. That's not how politics work. And when you look at people, for example, when you look at the founders of the U.S., the people who wrote the U.S. Constitution, they didn't think democracy was guaranteed. In fact, the very somewhat bizarre U.S. Constitution, the Electoral College, all of our complicated voting systems, a lot of that was put into place as a guarantee against the demagogue whom they imagined would eventually arise to try to upset the system. Of course, their imagination was based on their reading of classical literature. They were thinking about Caesar. And they imagined somebody like Caesar coming along, and so they put in these checks, and that's what the checks and balances were for. That was what that's what the Electoral College was for. Not that it ever worked that way, or not that it serves that function anymore, but obviously the purpose was not so that Michigan gets to decide who wins the presidential election, or that every year most campaign money is spent in Georgia. That wasn't in the mind of the authors of the Constitution. Over the last several decades, since the Second World War, but even more so since the end of the Cold War, we in our societies have been so fortunate and so lucky and so relatively prosperous and so relatively stable. I mean, we can all point to ups and downs in the last few decades. That I think we've forgotten that nothing is guaranteed. There's no curve of historical inevitability. Everything that happens tomorrow depends on what people do today, and so it's just useful once in a while to remember that. So by the way, I don't think that it's inevitable that dictatorship wins, but neither is it inevitable that democracy wins.
We did think there was an inevitable curve. Back in the 90s.
We did. Well,
there seemed to be a sort of progress.
There's even this is too much detail to go into. There was a theory in political science: if you've had a certain number of free elections, then you'll be a democracy forever and ever. And there was also, as you say, and I write about a little bit in the book, this burst of confidence in the 90s when there was a huge wave of democratization, not just in Europe, which is probably what people here remember most, but in Latin America and around the world. The fall of communism inspired a wave of democratic transitions. And it felt to many people like this was inevitable. And there's the famous Frank Fukuyama end of history thesis, which he says was written the wrong way, and everybody misinterpreted it. And actually, I heard him recently at an event, and somebody asked him something about the end of history. This is a book he wrote 30 years ago, and he said, "I'm asked that question twice a week. I've been answering it twice a week for 30 years. I can do it again tonight, or you could give me a break." But the reason why his essay on the end of history was so popular and was swept up, I think, is because it's what people wanted to believe, and somehow it felt like it could be true. And everybody wants to think we live in the best of all possible worlds, we live in the best possible society. Sooner or later, everybody will want to be like us. And I think that sense of inevitability also allowed us to be irresponsible in a way. I mean, if we're always going to be a democracy and there's nothing really you have to do to keep it going or participate, then you can get on with life. You can go and make money or paint paintings or write books, and you don't have to worry about politics because there's a class of politicians and they'll deal with it. And you don't have to participate. And I think that was a dangerous assumption. So it was that assumption that I think eventually got us into trouble. We let a lot of things happen by rote.
Allied to, or walking alongside that theory that democracy was the sort of inevitable end point for much of civilization, was the thought that if you traded with autocracies, they would become bound up with your economic way of life, but also your political way of life. And you write of this very early in the book, and it runs throughout the book. You think that was pretty heavily ingrained in the Western way of thinking about foreign policy.
Here's I want to be fair to the 1990s. So people in the 1990s and even earlier, people, particularly Europeans, had this experience. So after the Second World War, there were economic deals done first between France and Germany, then the European Union was created, and so on and so on. And their experience was that economic integration leads to some political integration, eventually to peace and prosperity, and so on. And it was true, and it worked. And in the 90s, that began to happen to Central Europe as well. And you could argue that Poland and the Czech Republic and so on also, that trade and economic links helped to tie them to the rest of Europe. So it wasn't that it was crazy. And also I should add another thing, which is that many people in Russia thought that, or hoped that. They wanted also these economic links to lead eventually to political integration and maybe the democratization of Russia. And you can find people who believe that in China as well. So it wasn't just like something we imagined. There was, however, a clear moment after which it was no longer true, and it began to become, in my view, it was much earlier in Russia than people thought, when it became clear that the Russian elite, the Russian, as we started calling them, oligarchs, were taking advantage of trade as a way of, the essential model for gaining power. This is how Putin came to power, was through stealing money from the state, laundering it through Western financial institutions, bringing it back to Russia, and then using it to win influence and power. And I'm not sure there was that much we could do about it, but we let it happen. We assumed it was okay. We turned a blind eye. We let them use Western institutions, and that was part of what. It was part of course, what created the system that we have now in Russia, and it was also what created a lot of cynicism about the language we were using at the same time. And the reason I learned this from the Russian opposition. The Russian opposition would say, you all talk about human rights and democracy, but you're enriching these guys and you let them buy houses in London using anonymous companies. Why? So there was a moment after which it was becoming clear that the trade was not creating, mutual integration, but it was instead building up a very toxic regime. There's the argument in China is a little bit different, but you can also say that and this I think the business community has already reached this conclusion, that there was a moment after which it was unclear who was benefiting most, and was this creating political integration, or was it simply enriching a Chinese Communist Party that had not 100% friendly feelings about us.
You specifically detail the agreement to build gas pipelines, shipping Russian gas into Central and Western Europe, providing it relatively cheaply to Western Europe. Again, that was seen clearly as one way of drawing Russia in, and it was seen as a very reliable supplier up to a certain point. Do you see it as an attempt to make the West dependent upon Russia?
So it's very funny when you look back in the history of the gas pipeline. It's a very weird story. I mean, it starts in the first meetings between it was West German and Austrian industrialists, and what was the sort of the Soviet Ministry of Gas kind of people was in a Habsburg hunting lodge, and and at the time there were still Russian and American soldiers looking at each other across the wall in Berlin. The Russians had only just recently left Vienna a few years earlier, so it was a very weird moment to be talking about pipelines. But it's also clear that from the very beginning, there were, aside from the economic benefits, and there were some, I mean, the gas was much cheaper and the pipeline technology was better than it had been, and it was very important for German development in particular, but also the rest of Europe to have the gas. But it was pretty clear from the beginning that there were big political interests on both sides that were slightly different. So the West Germans, there were a series of West German leaders, famously Willy Brandt, who believed that if we build these pipelines, this will be a solid economic interest that will keep us linked, and it will prevent war. I mean, and we won't go to war because we'll have these big economic interests. So from the beginning, he wanted there to be more pipelines and more. He wanted this dependency. What the Soviet Union wanted is probably also depended on who was in charge at the time. But I think they also saw that there could be a political gain from having this advantage. And of course, Americans from the very beginning worried that that was the real purpose of it, that there was some interest in blackmail. But what was never really resolved at the time was this weird morality. I mean, on the one hand, at that time, the Soviet Union was locking up dissidents, sponsoring terrorist movements in Europe, creating havoc in various ways, and at the same time, it wasn't just West Germany, the Netherlands, lots of other countries who benefited from the pipelines were effectively supporting the Soviet state and keeping it going through buying gas. And nobody really worked it out. I mean, there was a kind of, everybody stepped away and said, that's a very interesting problem, and no one really debated it. And some people questioned it, as I said, lots of American presidents worried about it. But then as the when the Soviet Union came to an end, it was almost like even that debate just disappeared. And everybody said, right, we'll trade with them and we'll have democracy. It was almost as if that ambiguous early era was forgotten.
And then when the trading relationship built in what you might call the new era of autocracy, you see money pouring through places like the City of London. And again, you write about this, and you say it may be time to make the very wealthy choose between autocracy and democracy. And when we're talking about the very wealthy, we're talking about law firms, accountancy firms, reputation management firms, public relations, this gamut of people who have serviced autocrats and their helpers. Do you believe that is realistic, that this very important sector of society could be made to choose?
Well, we decide what the rules are. We created the world in which money laundering is in effect happening. We allowed the existence of anonymous companies and anonymously purchased properties. We created the legal system around the offshore world. Yeah. We can decreate it. It's not like these things are natural. It's not like they're volcanoes or natural rock formations that can't be moved. They're creations of the law and of our own customs, and so we can decreate them. And actually, we're moving in that direction already. It's beginning to happen. Complicated, but it's almost like we allowed these things to emerge, and they became natural and part of the landscape. Yeah. And maybe there's a moment where we say, right, why do we need this? Why is that legal? Why is there one world in which people have to obey the law? And most financial institutions are highly regulated, and they worry all the time about transparency issues, and they have compliance officers and lawyers who and yet there's this alternate world that exists alongside where people don't worry about it, or they seek to avoid it, or the point of what they're doing is to not just avoid tax, but to hide money or channel drug money or channel stolen money, and we effectively have allowed that to happen.
When you've been looking at, crude phrase, democracy versus autocracy, do you think now autocracies have got better than democracy in responding to all their environmental challenges and critically cooperating?
They are. No, we still manage to cooperate in lots of ways. It's not that they're better, it's that they've learned some things from us. Yeah. So, they learned how to use globalization to their advantage. For example, that the internet is now a global conversation, and it's, you can intervene in it just as well from St. Petersburg as you can from Plymouth. So they've begun to understand some things, and I think there are some ways in which, and the jury is still out on this, but there's some forms of modern technology that are working to their advantage too. Obviously, surveillance technology, yeah. if they it's the Chinese really who've mastered that, could work in their interest. And it's really incumbent upon us to think about how to make that kind of technology compatible with democracy. And that's not just surveillance technology, but the internet more broadly as well.
Do you think the autocrats themselves, this generation, autocrats 2.0, are cleverer than the ones of the last century?
Some of them are very clever and some of them are very stupid. Look at what kind of regimes we're talking. When anybody who says autocracy is better has to explain to me why Zimbabwe and Venezuela are better than, any of their neighbors. The autocracies are in some ways as economically as different from one another as democracies are too. Also, just to be clear, the book isn't an argument that there are two camps and that the two camps sit on opposite sides of some metaphorical Berlin Wall. The argument is that there are a lot of mixed countries, there are a lot of illiberal democracies, there are autocracies that are that aren't seeking to undermine the West by you can look at the Arab world monarchies. You could also look at Vietnam, which is a country that is clearly not a democracy, but is also not particularly interested in undermining America or Europe. In fact, is, I think, hoping to trade more with us. I mean, so there's a range of countries. The book is and the solution or the answers to the the dilemma created by this network is not some kind of new Cold War. I don't believe in that at all. I think what we should be doing is looking not at particular autocracies, as our enemies. I mean, that serves no purpose. But looking rather at autocratic behaviors, the anti-transparency, the deliberate sowing of disinformation. In some cases, in the case of the war in Ukraine, the illegal use of violence and force. Yeah. I mean, we could look at those behaviors and think about how to counter them, and some of those behaviors are here. I mean, they're in London, or they're in Washington, or they're in Paris. So it's more about thinking about how do we change those things rather than I'm not calling for us to go to war with China, just to be clear. So.
But you are, to some degree, calling on the West, democracies, whatever you want to call it.
The democratic world. It's a very useful phrase.
To try and counter the narrative that is put forward by autocratic networks. And it begs the question about why you think autocracies have become so interested in the narrative and in shaping opinions in the West.
So this is they've told us. I mean, this is both, particularly China and Russia, have become very clear about the need to defeat what they see as the ideas coming from our part of the world. There's a marvelous document that was produced in China in 2013 by the Chinese Communist Party, and it has this great name, and it's called Document Number 9. And it lists the perils facing the Chinese Communist Party. And number one is 2013. Number one is Western constitutional democracy. And also on the list are the ideas about free press. There's something about civic engagement. There are a series of ideas and practices that are considered to be very dangerous to Chinese communism. And this is because, again, these are the ideas that if they were to be put into practice, you couldn't have a one-party state, or you couldn't have one that rules opaquely. And so they began to see this set of ideas as a threat to them. And partly it's a threat because it's the language that their own opposition uses. So that's the language of the Hong Kong democracy movement, or the Navalny movement, or the women's movement in Iran. Or the Venezuelan opposition, which is very, very well organized and very articulate. That's the language that threatens them. And so they began to see this as a problem. Around about the same time, this is when, in 2014, after the revolution in Ukraine, you remember what that looked like. This is the revolution in Maidan of 2014. Yeah. This was a popular uprising that was calling for anti-corruption laws and for joining the European Union, by which they meant joining the world of rule of law. It wound up scaring the pro-Putin, he was a kind of illiberal president of Ukraine. It wound up scaring him. He ran away from the country, and then the mob came and sacked his palace, which was full of gold taps and ostriches and so on. That was Putin's nightmare. That's what he's afraid of. And there had been a few years earlier in 2011, there had been a kind of popular anti-corruption movement taking hold in Moscow too. So he saw that, and he thought, right, that is the thing that threatens me. And it was that movement in Ukraine that he identifies with Ukraine, by the way. It's part of I think it's a part of the reason why he's fighting the current war. That first, that was the inspiration for the first invasion of Crimea, and then for a series of illiberal and worse crackdowns that happened in Russia in the year afterwards. Yeah. So they begin to see this language and the possibility of popular uprising as a threat to them and their particular form of power.
So on the one hand, you have the risk of importing these dangerous ideas like freedom of speech and freedom of association. But the other part of the control of the narrative is also about undermining democracy, undermining the countries. I mean, and there is, dozens of examples. There's talk about a specific attempt to stir up trouble during the recent disorder here in Britain as well. Again, What is the goal there, do you think, of autocracies or an autocracy in trying to undermine institutions?
So we
here?
don't see it this way. So I imagine most people in this room don't wake up in the morning and worry about Putin, right? We don't worry about Russia. We don't think about China. We don't think of them as our enemies or as a threat. There are people in Moscow and Beijing who wake up in the morning and worry about us. They think that the ideas coming from our part of the world could be a threat to them. And so they think about how to undermine, not just the narratives of democracy, but actual democracies, how to create chaos, how to disrupt elections, how to support the far right or sometimes the far left, how to pump up extremism, how to encourage rioting, how to encourage protest. Because anytime we look bad for whatever reason, that gives them extra points. So they have they really have just one narrative that matters, and then everything else kind of circulates around it. And that is, they want their own populations to believe that autocracy is stable and safe, and will keep you protected from change. Yeah. And democracy is violent and dangerous and divisive, and you don't want that.
And it's a zero-sum game.
It's in a way, this was particularly a problem for Putin. So most Russians, until fairly recently, thought of themselves as Europeans. I mean, they're part of European culture, and the Tolstoy spoke French, and so on. And so it's been very important for Putin to say, no, Europe is dangerous and degenerate, by which he means sexually degenerate. And you don't want any part of that divided, ugly, divisive place. We have a different kind of culture. And so towards that end, I mean, if there was I think this is cited in the book, it's one of my favorite political science studies ever, and there are not that many that are this much fun, but I think they were Estonians. They did a survey of Russian television, and they monitored it over a period of time and looked at every single, on 2 or 3 of the channels, every single news item about Europe. Yeah. And repeatedly, over and over again, it was about immigrants murdering people. It was about social workers taking away your children. It was about, homosexuals taking over, the schooling system. I mean, some of it was true, some of it was exaggerated, some of it was entirely made up. But the idea was to show that democracy is unstable and dangerous and so on. So anytime they can poison the idea of democracy at home, that's good for them. And increasingly, it's their interest to weaken us as well. And if they can weaken us politically, then they won't have to fight us militarily. So if Putin can win the war in Ukraine just by sowing narratives about, whether it's Ukraine fatigue or the inevitability of Russian victory. If they can convince us of that, then they don't have to win on the battlefield. And so it's just much cheaper. So they invest a lot of time thinking about how to do that. How do you create instability? How do you create a pro-Russian sentiment, and so on and so on.